10 gruesome murder cases you've probably never heard of. There have been murder cases that have rocked the country, like the murders of Lacey Peterson or of John Benet Ramsey, but there are millions of other murders that never make national headlines. We rounded up some of the most gruesome and upsetting murders that you may have never heard of. The Papin sisters, who murdered their bosses in cold blood. French sisters Leah and Christine Papin worked as live-in servants for the Lancelin family in France in 1926. Although it was reported that they acted quite odd, never talking to anyone but themselves and showing little interest in anything besides each other, according to historic mysteries. They did their work quickly and lived with the family for almost 7 years. Then, one night in February 1933, Mr. Lancelin, who had been waiting for his wife at a friend's house, came home to find her and their adult daughter dead on the floor in a pool of blood. Their eyes had been gouged out and faces smashed in. The Papin sisters were locked in their room, and after getting a locksmith to open the door, the police said they found the sisters lying on the bed together with a bloody hammer nearby, according to the Vintage News. The Papin sisters immediately confessed to the crimes. While in prison, Christine became very distressed from being away from her sister and was eventually granted permission to see Leah. Reports said that the sisters seemed to be unnaturally close to each other, with some suggesting a sexual relationship, though doctors who examined the Papin sisters denied evidence of that. A few months later, Christine suffered a mental breakdown and tried to gouge out her own eyes. After their trial, Christine was sentenced to life in prison for being the mastermind behind the murders, while Leah was eventually released from prison in 1943 and managed to get a job at a French hotel under a new identity. It is believed that she died in 1982, but that has never been confirmed. Acid bath murderer John George Hay. John George Hay was a British serial killer active in the late 40s. He used to dispose of his victims' bodies by burning them in sulfuric acid, according to Forensic magazine. Hay was convinced he was getting away with murder, literally, because he mistakenly thought that without a body there was no crime. His arrogance is what ultimately got him caught when he led police to the remains of his sixth and final victim, 69-year-old Olive Duran Deacon. While on trial, Hay pleaded insanity and insisted to the court that he drank the blood of his victims. He was found guilty in 1949 and hanged a few months later. Robert Berdella, the Butcher of Kansas. In the late 80s, Robert Berdella tortured and killed 6 men, chopped their bodies into small pieces, and stuffed their remains into dog food bags, according to the New York Daily News. He also kept detailed notes on each of his victims, which later helped investigators prove their murders. Berdella almost got away with it all. Had it not been for his 7th would-be victim, 22-year-old Christopher Bryson, who managed to escape from the 2nd floor of Berdella's home, he may have not been caught. Berdella was originally charged with sexual assault, but after police obtained a search warrant, they found human remains and other wallets of other victims. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and died of a heart attack in jail in 1992. Dennis Nilsen, who murdered young men and kept their bodies. Dennis Nilsen terrorized London in the late 70s and early 80s, killing 15 men over a 5-year period. Nilsen would pick up young men at bars and take them back to his home. There, he'd strangle or drown them. Once dead, he'd bathe and dress the bodies, according to the International Business Times. He admitted to police that he kept the bodies for extended periods of time before disposing of them so that he could have sex with them and talk to them. He is currently serving a life sentence at the HMP Full Sutton prison in Yorkshire, England. Herb Baumeister, a serial killer who stashed bodies in his backyard. In the late 80s and 90s, Herbert Baumeister would lure gay men back to his pool house, then strangle them and dump them in the woods behind his home, according to People magazine. Baumeister had his pool area decorated with mannequins that were set up to seem like they were having a pool party. Baumeister's young son, Eric, even stumbled upon the remains of one victim while he was playing in the backyard. Once Baumeister realized the police were onto him, he fled to Ontario, Canada, and shot himself in the head at Pinery Provincial Park. In his suicide note, he blamed his failing marriage and business as the reason for his suicide and never confessed to any of the murders. Police estimate that he killed somewhere between 10 to 20 people. Gertrude Banaszewski, the torture mother. In 1965, police found the emaciated body of 16-year-old Indianapolis resident, Sylvia Likens. She was covered in cigarette burns and sprawled out on a filthy mattress in the home of 37-year-old Gertrude Banaszewski, according to Indianapolis Monthly. Sylvia and her sister Jenny boarded with Banaszewski because their parents were carnival workers and traveled a lot. The girl's father paid Banaszewski $20 a week in exchange for housing his daughters. If the money arrived late, and Banaszewski took out her anger on the girls. Eventually, she focused her beatings on Sylvia, alone. But this wasn't a crime of an adult beating on a child. Banaszewski was the mother of 7 children, all of whom lived in the house and partook in the violent and sadistic attacks against Sylvia. Neighborhood kids, some as young as 10, were invited to join in or watch. No one reported anything. In October 1965, Sylvia was beaten to death. Banaszewski apparently forced a neighbor to call the police and tell them Sylvia ran away. When police arrived at the home, Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, apparently whispered to one of the officers, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." Banaszewski got 20 years in prison and was then released. She moved to Iowa, changed her name, and died of lung cancer in 1990. The others, who were mainly children, all got away with short sentences, if any. Catherine Knight, who tried to feed her husband to his children. Catherine Knight, an Australian woman, stabbed her partner, John Price, to death 37 times in 2000. Knight then skinned him, decapitated his head, and cooked up parts of his body. She set her dining room table for 2 and served the cooked meat with baked potatoes and side vegetables. She placed handwritten notes next to each table setting with the names of Price's children on them. She was attempting to serve them their father for dinner. When police finally arrived at the house, they found Knight in a comatose state with pills spilled out on the floor. They also found Price's head boiling in a pot of soup on the stove. Knight was the first woman to be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. She is currently serving her sentence in Silverwater Correctional Complex in New South Wales, Australia. Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer. In January 1968, women in Portland were terrorized by Jerry Brudos, a man who was alleged to have a foot fetish, and 4 vanished completely, according to the New York Daily News. About a year later, a fisherman found the remains of a 22-year-old woman, Linda Sally, who had disappeared the year before. Police ended up finding 4 more bodies and eventually tracked them all back to Brudos. He confessed to the murders in gory detail to the police. After keeping the body of his first victim for several months, in order to dress her up, he eventually dumped the victim in the river, but not before sawing off a foot to use for trying on heels and taking photos of them. In another horrific find, detectives discovered that he would keep souvenirs of his crimes, including shoes, bras, girdles, and even a paperweight he made out of human breasts. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Known as the BTK killer, Dennis Rader used to break into his victims' homes, in and around Sedgwick County, Kansas, and stalk them before making his move. He would then bind, torture, and kill them, which is where he got his nickname from, according to the Wichita Eagle. He killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991 but wasn't arrested until 2005. Once apprehended, police searched Rader's home and found photos of Rader with his victims. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and is now serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Issei Sagawa, the Japanese cannibal who still walks free. The famous Japanese cannibal is notorious in his country. He grew up in a wealthy family but always had the urge for human flesh. At 23, Sagawa was arrested for attempted rape, according to Culture Crossfire. He entered the apartment of a tall German woman living in Tokyo and attacked her. Police didn't realize he was actually attempting to eat her, even though he bit off a piece of her flesh. Sagawa, who is 5 feet tall, later told Vice he was obsessed with taller Western women. At 32, Sagawa went to study literature in France, even receiving his PhD. It was there that he befriended a classmate, a 25-year-old Dutch woman named Renee Hartvelt. The friendship proved deadly for Hartvelt as one night in 1981, Sagawa invited her over under the guise of working on a poetry assignment but ended up shooting her in the neck and eating various parts of her body over a 2-day span. He attempted to dump the leftovers of her body in a lake nearby but was caught in the act. He was held in police custody for 2 years before being deemed legally insane and deported back to Japan. Once in Japan, He was declared sane by psychologists and signed himself out of the mental institution where he was being held. He currently lives as a free man in Japan. Thank you again for joining us for another video. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe and comment down below and let us know what you would like to hear in the near future. See you all again soon.